morning, Willow students and families. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. Thank you all for your patience as we got used to our new distance learning model. I was able to join a lot of classes, and it was incredible to see all your smiling faces and see you guys all connect with one another. So thank you for joining us on this new venture and trying this new platform and seeing already that it is helping us to build community and connect with one another. So we'll start again today with some breathing. Today, as you're breathing, I really want you to focus on breathing in through your nose and feeling your diaphragm expand as you take a breath in, and then releasing that breath slowly. So as a reminder, our virtues this month are gentleness and humility. And as I was thinking about different ways to think about these virtues, there's one person that really stood out to me as an embodiment of both gentleness and humility. And the part of gentleness that I think is most pertinent to this person is the idea that they lead with love and the desire to care for others, but leading through courage without violence, without strength, without hardness, without harshness. And I think this person really embodied that. So the person I want to talk a little bit about is Fred Rogers. He's more well known as Mr. Rogers and had a really popular children's television show called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Fred Rogers was born in March 20th, 1928 in Pennsylvania and attended Dartmouth College for a year. So he was an alum at the school that I went to. He ultimately graduated from the Rollins College with a degree in music composition and later attended the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Child Development and studied child psychology and actually practiced in child psychology. And that's where he started working with puppets as a way to run groups with children and as a way for them to share their feelings. So as I shared, Mr. Rogers is really well known for a show that he created and wrote all the content, even the music. As you saw, he composed music himself, but really did all of the creation of the puppets, the sets, writing the script, hosting the show, writing the songs, and writing all the music for it. And what was really unique about Mr. Rogers is that at that time, most children's programming was either cartoons that didn't necessarily have an educational purpose, or Sesame Street and other shows like that were really focused on getting kids ready for school. And what was unique about Mr. Rogers is that he saw television as an opportunity to nurture children's social development. And he really focused on helping them develop their moral compass and ethical reasoning. And as you can see from the quote there, he went into television because he did not like how it was being used, but saw it as a fabulous instrument to nurture those who would watch and listen. At the time that the show aired, which was back in 1968, there was a lot of civil unrest in the United States, and he also used his show and his voice as a platform to fight for equal rights for different folks within our communities. He's gotten a lot of notoriety recently for an example of where he did this. He testified for the Senate subcommittee, and he was really pushing for the federal government to fund public broadcasting to ensure that anyone, regardless of their access to resources, could have really high quality educational television that would help them develop both intellectually and also emotionally. So at the time in 1969, he testified before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Communications, and that was chaired by Senator John Pastore. A little bit of context about what was happening. Lyndon Johnson, before he left office, had proposed a $20 million bill for the creation of PBS so that the public broadcasting station would be subsidized by the federal government. But his successor, Richard Nixon, wanted to cut the funding in half to just $10 million. And so they brought in Mr. Rogers to talk about the value and purpose of public television. And I highly recommend going back and watching his speech, because it really does show how you can use humility and gentleness and still be convincing. And it's really incredible to watch the senators in that subcommittee, particularly Senator Pastore, really be moved emotionally by how he talked about the purpose of his television show, but also public broadcasting in general. It was really successful, and he was able to increase funding from the $9 million that they were proposing to $22 million. And shortly after that, in 1970, Richard Nixon actually appointed Mr. Rogers as the chair of the White House Conference on Children and Youth. So I had a really personal connection to Mr. Rogers in a number of different ways. But one of them was that he was an alum at Dartmouth, and he actually did the keynote speech, the commencement speech at my graduation. And what was really incredible is that for our graduations, the graduates actually line up along the green as the trustees process through the green. And I was kind of at the tail end of that procession and was standing next to a group of kids, and Mr. Rogers actually stopped and introduced himself to all of the kids that were along that route and said hi to them and the graduates that were standing there. So I actually got to meet him a few minutes before he went up and spoke to our entire class. He was really well known for his commencement speeches, and one thing that he always included was a moment to reflect on those people in your lives that had gotten you to that point and really influenced you and supported you. And that was particularly compelling for me because my grandmother had died just a couple of weeks before that, and I was really sad because she wasn't there for my graduation. And you can see I still get emotional about it because it really touched me. So what I wanted to share with you guys was some excerpts from his speech. So I hope that you will sit back and listen, and I'll share a couple of the quotes from the speech that most moved me that day. Probably my favorite of his quotes from that speech was this: "Our world hangs like a magnificent jewel in the vastness of space. Every one of us is part of that jewel, a facet of that jewel. And in the perspective of infinity, our differences are infinitesimal. We are intimately related. We may never pretend that we are not." He also talked a little bit about his experience at Dartmouth and a professor that moved him. And he said, "During my first year, I lived right over there at 101 Middle Mass, which happened to be the same dorm I was in my freshman year. And I had two roommates. I had a professor over there who did his best to scare everyone in his class, and he gave me the lowest grade that I ever had in any school anywhere. But I also had an astronomy professor, George Dimitrov, who looked for and found what was best in each of his students. When I look at that night and the night sky, I still think of that extra special kind man." He also shared an anecdote from the Special Olympics that had happened a couple of months before that. And he wrote, or he said, "Have you heard my favorite story that came from the Seattle Special Olympics? Well, for the 100-yard dash, there were 9 contestants, all of them so-called physically or mentally disabled. All 9 of them assembled at the starting line, and at the sound of the gun, they took off. Not long afterward, one little boy stumbled and fell and hurt his knee and began to cry. The other 8 children heard him crying. They slowed down, turned around, and ran back to him. Every one of them ran back to him. One little girl with Down syndrome bent down and kissed the boy and said, 'This'll make it better.' The little boy got up, and he and the rest of the runners linked their arms together and joyfully walked to the finish line. They all finished the race at the same time, and when they did, everyone in that stadium stood up and clapped and whistled and cheered for a long, long time. People who were there are still telling the story with great delight. And you know why? Because deep down we know that what matters in life is more than winning for ourselves. What really matters is helping others win too, even if it means slowing down and changing our course now and then." He cited a quote from an old Roman philosopher, Nicias Manilius Severinus, Boethius. So pardon my Latin, I'm not as adept at it as Miss Miller is. But he was a Roman philosopher and the first of the scholastics of the Middle Ages. 1,500 years ago, Boethius wrote this sentence: "O happy race of mortals, if your hearts are ruled, as is the universe, by love." He also then wrote about choices. He also then spoke about choices. He said, I'm very much interested in choices and what it is and who it is that enable us human beings to make the choices we make all through our lives. What choices lead to ethnic cleansing? What choices lead to healing? What choices lead to the destruction of the environment? What choices encourage heroism in the midst of chaos? And then he shared the lyrics of one of his songs. There's a neighborhood song that is meant for the child in each of us, and I'd like to give you the words of that song right now. It's you I like, it's not the things you wear, it's not the way you do your hair, but it's you I like. The way you are right now, the way deep down inside you, not the things that hide you, not your caps and gowns, they're just beside you. But it's you I like, every part of you, your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you remember when you're feeling blue that it's you I like. It's you, yourself, it's you. It's you I like. When I say it's you I like, I'm talking about the part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. So, in all that you do in all of your life, I wish you the strength and the grace to make those choices which will allow you and your neighborhood to become the best of whoever you are. Congratulations to you all. So, as you go out today, I want you to think about a couple of different things. What's special about you? What's the change you want to see in the world? And how can you use love, gentleness, and humility to drive this change? And now I'll turn it over to Miss Lefferts, who has a great song for us today, one of my favorites again, the Garden Song. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.